Okay, so this week's another one about writing for literature, and we're focusing this time on the idea that writing about poetry is a very different skill to writing about prose or drama, the other genres there. So first of all, just very quickly, how? What's the main thesis for me for you in terms of how it is different? Well, what's the same is that, I'm referring to last week, it is still driven by this idea of a conceptual response and discussion. And people get this very wrong about poetry. So many times I get people responding, writing answers, and something about these poems makes them just list everything that they've learned. Okay, one thing after another. At the high levels we're looking for, you need to still be driven by a conceptual answer. And at the end of last week, and if you missed that, you can go back and look at it. At the end of last week, I used an example of a poetry question to show you how that conceptually might work. But the big difference comes with the AO2 work. When you're dealing with poetry, the close response to poetic methods is much more specific and analytical than with prose and drama. One of the problems that I think sometimes people can get into is when they're writing about, for example, an inspector calls, they may well take a specific word and write in huge depth about that specific word, or worse, they take a short quotation, pick every single word and analyze the impact of every single one of those words. Now remember, it's a play. Those words are said and gone in a few seconds. So that's kind of overdoing it in some ways for it, I reckon, the pudding. And with prose, again, although people reread and go back and look at what they've got, you know, in Christmas Carol, it's once again using prose techniques. I'll come back to that a little bit more. But with poetry, the entire thing is about that kind of really condensed, close, careful structure. When somebody is writing a poem, they'll go through drafts and drafts and drafts and drafts and drafts and drafts. Loads of things. Every little detail is really precisely chosen and put together. And therefore, we can look at those in a lot more depth, a lot more thought. But we can also focus on the particular methods that are attached to poetry. And that can help us a lot. So, to take you through this, I'm going to start, and I'm going to use Charge the Light Brigade for several reasons. One, it's a very high possibility of coming up this summer. And two, honestly, it's not much of a poem at all. So I thought, well, hang on, if we look at one that is challenging because it's not necessarily the greatest poem of all time, then hopefully that makes it much easier to deal with better ones that have a lot more going on. Charge the Light Brigade, I mean, you know, Tennyson, the poet who wrote it, is a terrific poet, wrote some wonderful stuff, but he knocked this up in about 10 minutes. He was told to write it after the event of the Charge the Light Brigade, and you can see it's like a lot of words repeated over and over again. But there still is enough in there for us to really take this somewhere interesting. Now, I started, first of all, by thinking once again about the idea of a conceptual response to the poem. I'm deliberately not working on the idea of a particular question at this point. I'm just showing you really how we can address poems. So, for me, conceptually, what is Tennyson trying to do? He's trying to place us alongside the soldiers. Why is he doing that? He's doing it to try and get us to appreciate their heroism. They are heroes. We will best understand it. We are there alongside them, riding along into war. But I would argue he does still give us a sense of the horror of war. It may not be quite the level of the horror of war that you get in something like Bayonet Charge or Exposure, but there is some understanding that the horror is there. Now, if that's where I'm starting from, what I'm going to do very quickly with you, and I'm going to move quite quick here, is I'm going to look at some of the kind of things that I might pick out of Charge the Light Brigade to analyse in a bit more depth, okay, and explain why, to show you what I mean by looking at the specific poetic techniques, right? Now, obviously, one of the key things in Charge the Light Brigade is the use of repetition. There is so much repetition in this poem. It's ridiculous. And one of the things that's repeated is the 600, the number of people that we've got there. So again, that is a technique that he's using to draw our attention to the fact that there were 600 soldiers in charge of the light brigade, or in the light brigade. A small number when you're fighting an army, but a huge number of soldiers to lose. So both a huge number and a small number at the same time. A detail that I would select and notice here. I would pick out the idea, again, dealing very much with this idea of heroism. Again, appreciate the heroism, as well as there being 600 of them. The hyperbole, again, being very precise with what he's doing with the hyperbole into the valley of death. Massively exaggerated, okay, in terms of its effect there. And later on, that valley of death becomes jaws of death and the mouth of hell, so it appears to get even worse. So he's clearly trying to show us the heroism by really exaggerating what we're actually encountering here. In the second stanza, the simple repetition, again, of there's not to, there's not to, there's but to, is very much placed there to emphasize the duty of a soldier. So as well as telling us they're going into the valley of death, look at what they're doing. It doesn't matter if it was a mistake. It's not down to them. It's not theirs to make reply when somebody tells them to go and do something stupid. It's not theirs to reason why. That's not how armies work. Theirs is but to do and die. Again, another kind of hyperbolic, exaggerative statement there. So again, I'm looking at the technique, the fact that the simple repetition makes the duty sound relatively simple. When I look at these verbs that we use here, flash, charging, plunged, flashing, all the same as there, charging away, plunge in the battery smoke. I'm talking about verbs that are chosen to, again, emphasize and possibly exaggerate the heroism of their actions. Look what they do. Their sabers are flashing. They're not kind of just attacking. It's like the sun is glinting off them because they're so heroic. They're charging an entire army. Small number of a massive army. What do? Most of us run away. But no, they charge into it because that's their heroism, to do and die. And even plunging into this battery smoke, the smoke created by the guns. Can't see what the other side of it. Not just till they go into it, they plunge into it with all enthusiasm. So, once again, we have the idea of verbs that exaggerate and emphasize. I mentioned the jaws of death and the mouth of hell, taking the idea of the valley of death further forward. But when you mention that they came through it, they came back from it, well, we're dealing with the extent of their bravery there. I mean, goodness me, it's bad enough going into the jaws of death. Literally, there's death, open jaws, riding into its mouth. Ridiculous. But the idea that you can do that and you can come back from it is hugely impressive. Okay, so we have their heroism very, very much set up for us through a number of poetic techniques. But now we start to think about also the way that war is being presented, and the potential sense of horror, as well as placing us alongside them through various techniques in there. Half a league, half a league, half a league onwards, as I'm sure you've thought about before, very much imitating the sounds of the horses galloping into battle, okay, as they go further forward. So we, from the beginning, are galloping with them into battle, and it's all part of the pace and the energy and the rhythm of the poem that takes us all the way through, and the repetition helps with. We have, again, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell. We have stormed out with shot and shell while horse and hero fell. We have all that was left of them, left of 600. 3 examples that emphasize the horror of the war, that they are required to go into the jaws of death or the mouth of hell, that they were not just shot at, but they were stormed at with their shots. They fell to their death. There were virtually none of them left at the end. These are things that do remind us of the horror of what they're going in, even though it's celebrating the heroism. I might also note there's no hint here of personality or humanity to the enemy. Okay, so we're not interested in them. We're just literally interested in our side here. There's no detail of death or injury. So although the horror is there, they're not trying to show us a sense that they shouldn't have gone in the first place. Okay. So what all of these examples are is poetic techniques. I wouldn't quite examine in this level and this small detail an extract from an Inspector Calls, for example, or from Macbeth quite in the same way. This is because it's shaped and put together so carefully, okay, and thoughtfully. So that's the first stage of it. But what I'm really talking to you about today is how you write about poetry. Now, I did this to illustrate, first of all, to you the kind of things we pick out. But how does our writing look different when we go into this? Well, here is a very high level, well, full marks example of a piece of writing in responding to that question. How does poetry present attitudes to war in Chant of Light Brigade and one other poem? This isn't the beginning of it. It has a thesis statement that comes before it. This is just a section of writing. And what I want to do is look at how this makes use of those poetic techniques to really get to the heart of what it's trying to say. So this paragraph, it begins, as you would expect, with a topic sentence that introduces the idea, despite the upbeat tone of the poem. And notice immediately, even in the topic sentence, this person is using the sense of it as a poem, the tone of it underneath. Now, we've all got that, haven't we? It does sound very exciting and dramatic, Chant of the Light Brigade. It doesn't sound like something horrific. So despite the upbeat tone of the poem, Tennyson never shies away from presenting war as horrific. So there we go, an example of what we were looking at before, conceptual topic sentences that just set up a proper argument. When, though, then he starts to talk about a particular example here, look at the way that the poetic technique is being used. Repeatedly, he describes the charge, okay? Making use of the idea of repetition, but not just saying, he uses repetition too. Repeatedly, he does this. And then drawing in that the conflict is being personified by calling it the mouth of hell, right? So again, it's not look at the techniques I know, it's that the writing of the sentences, once you get into the analysis, focuses on the technique itself, right? Now, of course, the particular example is mouth of hell. And then having focused on that, of course, we now need to interpret and discuss it, which it does here. Personifying the conflict as waiting to swallow them into everlasting torment, because it's a mouth and it's hell. We've got that. It's interpreted that way. But it's not just telling us what it means, it's personifying it this way repeatedly, okay? Because that shows you it's pretty horrific. It doesn't have to repeat again at the afterwards. This is really horrific. It's obvious. We're talking about it to begin with. But again, notice that approach. And we see it again straight afterwards. Watch once again, the red bits here. This is more about structure. Because remember, one of the key things about a poem is how it's put together. Okay, the structure of it. Even at the opening, what does he do? He establishes the setting. Now, again, the setting is a war battlefield, so it's going to show us the horrors of war that he's talking about here. Following up, what's the impact of it? Even at the opening, after the gentle gallop of half a league, he established the setting as the Valley of Death. Now, here the analysis includes the example, right? It doesn't have to, it's not, presented at the opening, he says, Tennyson repeats the phrase half a league. This suggests that this is a gentle gallop. Rather than go into that kind of lengthy or over the wordy, it's much more focused because the argument is about, he opens by presenting a gentle gallop. He establishes the setting as the valley of death. They're gently galloping into the valley of death. Horrific. Okay. The same pattern continues. But in this case, it takes another sentence in here to take us a different direction. His intentions may be to honor the soldiers, sure, but there is no sense of honor in war itself. Another sentence, kind of mini topic sentence within it. And you can see what he does with it afterwards, using sound of the cannon surrounding them. Again, a very poetic response. Sound, the use of sound. We've had the setting and basically the structure of it. We've had the repetition and personification. Now we're having the use of sound. And there's the impact. When he mentions it straight away, what's it there to do? It's there to create a hellscape. Okay, right? Of cannon surrounding them. And then, and again, be aware how this is done in terms of the sentence writing as well as the poetry. Dropped in between two dashes, as though it's a kind of an extra thought going underneath. The onomatopoeic effect of the word. Once again, focused around the technique, but immediately going to the impact, emphasizing its firing power. And finally, same again, shots that volley thundered stormed at them as though attributing anger to the shells themselves. Now, what I'm showing you there, hopefully, is first of all, one of the key things in writing here about poetry is how central the techniques and the detail is to your answer. But secondly, it's not about technique spotting. It's not like we're on safari here, trying to spot as many giraffes as we can, and oh, there's a lion, right? You know, oh, there's a bit of alliteration. Not that we're looking for that at all. None of that there says he does this, full stop, as though that's the point. It just uses that to draw us in straight away to an explanation of the impact of it. So the whole thing revolves around what has the poet done poetically and what's the impact that presents war as horrific. Lots in there in a small amount of time. Now, it's all very well me saying that and me saying, okay, you know, that's different to prose and drama. But what are we looking at here? What are we looking at here that is different? Well, let's have a very, very quick look at an example of an inspector calls response at a high level. How is this different in the way it handles it? This is an Arthur Berlin question. Okay. And it's an Arthur Berlin question dealing with the idea of views of Arthur Berlin, the sense of him as a hard-headed practical man of business, that kind of thing here. Now, if we take the same color coding to think about, again, how are the techniques being used? What we get here is things such as the creation of a character, characterization. We get the fact that as soon as we hear him speak, it's a drama. So again, we're thinking about us as an audience listening to him. We're saying that structurally, before Even's even mentioned, he systematically ridicules, Priestley systematically ridicules Arthur. We get, again, presenting an idea overall, presenting business. We're talking about the arrival of a character once the inspector arrives. We're not here dealing with onomatopoeia, with precise repetition, with the impact of putting several phrases together or something like that. We're dealing with a much broader idea of it as a play to be seen. Because as we say, we will all notice the way that Arthur speaks when we're in the audience. We'll all notice that he's been ridiculed before we even hear about this person. We'll all notice the entrance of the inspector, but we wouldn't necessarily notice a tiny little phrase that's being used. So it doesn't always help us as much as we think. Okay? So you see what I mean? This is a much broader discussion, still really going quite deep if you look at it, but it's not as focused on specific moments or specific techniques and their exploitation, because drama is a very different genre to poetry. Okay, to return then back to that question we had, this person carries on with one of the moments that I've talked about before, taking it down a different line, yet in this case. And you can see how this bit is constructed as well. You take your time to have a look at that as it's been set up here, that it starts again with that topic sentence. Yet war isn't really the target. The horrors of war create heroes. So it brings into that idea of heroism. The way that he focuses on something with constant repetition. The use of verbs to glorify their actions. The climax of the poem, in which he changes the way they're referred to from the 600 to actually calling them hero. These are poetic techniques that are being used, and each one is followed up by a quite deep and thorough analysis or interpretation. The constant repetition of 600, as we said, only serving to remind us that although it's a huge number to lose, it's a tiny number to charge an army, and the enthusiasm suggested by the verb charge only emphasizes their heroism. That the use of verbs to glorify an action in battle, just like we talked about there, flashed in an almost fantastical way as they fought, plunged into the smoke of the guns, a confident move even though they can't see what awaits them. And then we bring it together at the end. So once again, hopefully, that is demonstrating to you quite a bit what, with Charge of the Light Brigade here, we mean by writing about poetry in a different way. That we are taking those details that I looked at to begin with. And that should inform your revision. Because in your revision, remember, there are two types of poem in the end for you. There's the one that will be printed on the page you have to write about. And then there's the poem that you choose to write about, to compare with it. When you're revising all of them, or as we say, as many of them as are likely to come up to be in front of you, you are looking at the kind of things that I've just annotated there. That's what you're preparing in advance. You're thinking, what are the poetic techniques? What are the ways that they are producing the meaning that we're looking for? Let's bring that together by thinking about another poem that, again, is very possible to come up this year. Very possible it comes up this year. The Emigre. And a poem that I like very much. I think it's far better than Charge of the Light Brigade, far more complex in certain ways, but people sometimes can get a bit caught up with and unsure of, especially those who don't read I Have No Passport, There's No Way Back at All, and decide she actually does go back to her country. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire thing with you again. I'm just going to show you again a piece of writing about the Emigre that focuses on it as a piece of poetry. It's very easy with something like the Emigre, probably more than Charge of the Light Brigade, to just start to talk about what happens in it. I mean, obviously at the heart of the Emigre is the fact that it's about how your memories, your view of a place or of a thing are more powerful than the actual reality. That's what she's on, which sounds a ridiculous thing to say, doesn't it? You know, if your country's been torn to shreds by horrific tyrants and things like that, to say that, yeah, but what I've got up here is much more powerful. Sounds ridiculous, but of course she argues that very well and points out to us that the idea is that will eventually end and nothing can be done to stop the idea that's in her head. So when we look at something like this, okay, once again, I'm not going to do it with colors here, but you can hopefully see the way that the focus on the detail is used to explore a, again, conceptual idea. Rumans continually promotes the idea that her idealized view of this country is more powerful than the reality of its suffering. Her metaphor of it as a bright-filled paperweight, you can see how that's working, creates an impression of a lively, exciting place which holds her sense of identity in place. Yet, when juxtaposed with the reality of a country that is sick with tyrants, she is left with an impression of sunlight. This image of sunlight grows in strength throughout the poem. From an impression through tastes to evidence, it becomes more tangible and definitive as the reality grows worse and worse. We started with a metaphor. We looked at how that metaphor is juxtaposed with another metaphor. We then looked how it goes into an image of sunlight, which is of course repeated throughout the poem, right? Sunlight grows in strength as it repeated, using the details of it to show how it becomes more definitive. A beautifully developed argument that is focused on the construction of it as a poem, right? Not just focused on the fact she says one thing and then says something else as well. It's focused on the how she does it. Even more than this, lovely piece of connective writing there. She is branded by it. The metaphor suggesting this impression is permanent and that it has happened to her rather than being her own desire. What is vague and abstract outweighs reality because of the importance of memory and personal view. Now, yes, of course, they have an excellent understanding of it. They're very, very good English person writing. But what's brought them up there is they've taken the things we talked about, conceptual writing, but they've taken the idea of this as poetry. Now, remember, this isn't just relevant to your anthology. This is also relevant to your unseen poetry at the same time. Because even though you've never seen that before, you're still going to write about it in the same way as a poet. And I did a session on unseen poetry earlier, in which we looked at the ways of considering it as a poem. So, taking you back to the beginning. The reason for this is that poetry is a very different genre. And what I'm saying to you is that you can maximize your answer on the poetry, something that generally is weaker for most people in respect schools. You can maximize the impact and the quality of your writing by focusing in while you're discussing on those techniques, on it, construction as a poem. What makes it that way? Because there is so much more use of technique in constructing a poem, because it's so much more tight and compressed. It's 2 weeks. Let's hope that it comes up really well. What comes up, something good comes up for you.